Remove those dog tags, or I will hold you in contempt of court." The words cut through the San Diego County Courthouse like a blade, silencing the rustle of papers and the shuffle of feet. Every head in the gallery turned toward the bench, where Judge Victoria Ashworth leaned forward, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, her eyes fixed on the man standing before her with a particular disgust she reserved for those she considered beneath her courtroom. The man did not flinch. He stood in clothes that had been donated 3 owners ago, a jacket held together at the shoulder seam with strips of duct tape, work boots worn thin at the soles, and a beard that had not seen a razor in months. His name, according to the docket, was Elias Thorne. His charge was trespassing. His crime was seeking shelter from a thunderstorm in a doorway that belonged to someone who did not want him there. But his posture told a different story than his appearance. He stood with his weight evenly distributed, shoulders squared, spine straight. Not the posture of a man beaten down by circumstance. The posture of a man waiting. Judge Ashworth tapped her pen against her desk, the sound echoing in the silence. 24 years she had spent on this bench, and she had seen 100 men like this one. Men who wore military symbols they purchased at surplus stores for $5. Men who claimed sacrifice to excuse their failures. Men who expected the system to carry them because they could not carry themselves. "I asked you a question," she continued, her voice rising for the benefit of the gallery. "Those dog tags around your neck. Where did you purchase them? The Army surplus store on 5th Street, perhaps? They have quite a selection of costume jewelry for men who want to play soldier." The public defender, a young woman named Catherine Marsh who had been assigned the case 20 minutes before the hearing, opened her mouth to object, but no words came. She had tried to speak with her client before the proceedings. He had answered her questions in monosyllables, his voice so soft she had to lean close to hear him. When she asked about his military service, he had simply touched the tags at his chest and said nothing. In the front row of the gallery, a bailiff named Nathaniel Reyes shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He was a former Marine, 8 years of service before transitioning to court security. Something about the defendant bothered him, not his appearance. Reyes had seen plenty of homeless veterans cycle through these proceedings. It was something else, the way the man stood, the precision of his stillness, the way his eyes tracked movement in the room without his head turning. Reyes studied the defendant's forearm, where a torn sleeve revealed the edge of a faded tattoo. Coordinates, maybe. Numbers in a pattern he recognized, but could not quite place. Judge Ashworth was not finished. She removed her glasses and set them on the bench, a theatrical gesture she had perfected over decades. "When I see a man standing before me in rags, claiming to have served this country, I see one of 2 things. Either a man who squandered every opportunity the military gave him, or a man who never served at all and wears those tags to manipulate the sympathy of strangers. Which are you, Mr. Thorne?" The courtroom waited for his response. Elias Thorne lifted his gaze to meet the judge's eyes. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse from disuse, but something in it made the stenographer's fingers pause above her keyboard. "With respect, Your Honor," he said, "I would prefer not to remove them." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Prefer." She let the word hang in the air. "You prefer. Mr. Thorne, this is my courtroom. Your preferences are irrelevant. You will remove those tags, or I will add contempt charges to your trespassing offense. Do I make myself clear?" In the back of the gallery, a woman named Diane Okonkwo held her phone steady beneath her jacket. She was a freelance journalist who covered court proceedings for a local news blog, looking for stories that the major outlets ignored. She had come today expecting nothing remarkable. Now her instincts told her to keep recording. The defendant remained motionless. His hands, weathered and scarred, hung loose at his sides. The judge waited. The gallery waited. The bailiff found himself holding his breath. Before we continue with this story, we want to know where you are watching from today. Drop a comment below and tell us your city or country. Because stories like this one, stories of hidden heroes who walk among us unrecognized, they happen everywhere. In every town, in every courtroom, on every street corner, there may be someone whose humble appearance conceals extraordinary service. Someone whose worn clothes hide medals they never speak about. If this story of courage and sacrifice and second chances speaks to you, consider subscribing to our channel so you do not miss what happens next. Your support helps us share these incredible true stories that honor the forgotten warriors among us. Now let us continue. Judge Ashworth leaned back in her chair, studying the man before her with renewed contempt. Very well, Mr. Thorne. If you insist on this little performance, let me make something clear. I have sat on this bench for 24 years. I have heard every excuse, every fabrication, every desperate plea for sympathy that men like you can conjure. You stand before me in donated clothes, smelling of the streets, clutching dog tags that prove nothing except your commitment to a fantasy. She gestured dismissively toward the public defender. Your counsel can confirm that unless you can produce documentation of your supposed service, those tags are nothing more than props. And props have no place in my courtroom. Elias Thorne said nothing, but his jaw tightened, and his right hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his chest where the tags hung beneath his tattered shirt. Bailiff Reyes took a step forward. Force recon. The words surfaced in his memory from somewhere distant. Camp Pendleton, 2001. Scout Sniper School. There had been an instructor, a legend among the trainers. A man whose patience with a rifle was spoken of in whispers. A man whose call sign had become a ghost story among the young Marines. But that man would be in his 60s now. That man would be honored and comfortable and surrounded by the recognition he had earned. That man would not be standing in a courtroom wearing rags, accused of sleeping in a doorway. Would he? The judge was speaking again, her voice sharp with impatience. I will give you one final opportunity, Mr. Thorne. Remove those tags, and we can proceed with your case in an orderly fashion. Refuse, and I will have no choice but to assume you are deliberately obstructing these proceedings. The clock on the courtroom wall showed 9:47 in the morning. But what Judge Victoria Ashworth did not know, what no one in that courtroom could possibly know, was that in exactly 47 minutes, the doors behind her would open, and a four-star general in full dress uniform would walk through them. And everything she thought she understood about the broken man standing before her would shatter into 1,000 pieces. Because some dog tags are not purchased at surplus stores. Some dog tags are earned in blood and fire and 19 hours of hell that most people could not survive for 19 minutes. And some men who look like they have nothing left are carrying the weight of 40 lives they saved and one life they could not. The morning before the arrest had begun the way every morning began for Elias Thorne. His eyes opened at 0500 precisely, no alarm needed, his body still operating on a schedule drilled into muscle and bone across 28 years of service. The concrete beneath his sleeping bag was cold, and the highway overpass above him rumbled with the first trucks of the day heading toward the naval base 3 miles east. He sat up slowly, his joints protesting the movement. 67 years old. 20 years ago, he could have slept on bare rock and risen without a complaint. Now, every morning reminded him of the shrapnel still embedded near his left shoulder blade, too close to the spine for surgeons to risk removing. The sleeping bag was olive green, military issue, worn thin in patches but still serviceable. He folded it with corners precise enough to pass inspection, a ritual he had never abandoned even when there was no one left to inspect. His rucksack contained everything he owned: a change of clothes, a canteen, a laminated photograph of 11 men in desert camouflage, most of their faces now belonging to the dead, a dog-eared astronomy book his father had given him before his first deployment, its spine cracked and pages soft from decades of handling, and 2 sets of dog tags that he had not removed from his neck in 15 years. Elias walked the 3 miles to the VA cemetery on foot, the same route he had walked every day for the past 4 years. The boots on his feet were held together with duct tape and determination. He had been offered new boots twice by outreach workers who sometimes passed through the underpass with supplies. Both times he had declined and pointed them toward younger veterans who needed them more. The cemetery gates opened at 6. He was always the first one through. Ruben Castillo's headstone was in Section 14, Row 7, Plot 23. White marble, standard issue, identical to the thousands of others that stretched across the green hillside in perfect formation. The only thing that distinguished it was the small Force Recon emblem someone had placed at its base years ago. Elias did not know who had left it. He had never moved it. He lowered himself to the grass beside the stone, his knees cracking with the effort. The morning sun was just beginning to warm the air, and somewhere in the distance a groundskeeper's mower hummed to life. "Still here, brother," Elias said quietly. "Still watching." He spoke to Reuben every morning, told him about the weather, about the news he overheard from other veterans at the soup kitchen, about the young Marine he had seen jogging past the underpass yesterday, barely 20 years old, with a whole war still ahead of him. Elias touched the headstone with fingers that had once been steady enough to thread a needle at 400 meters. They trembled now, but he no longer noticed. "You would laugh at me," he continued, "living under a bridge 3 miles from where we trained, eating meals from a church basement, looking like something the tide washed in." He paused, listening to the silence the way he had once listened for distant gunfire. "But I am still here. That is something. That has to be something." The memory came without warning, as it always did. March 2003. Ramadi. The convoy burning on the road below his position. 40 Marines pinned in a kill zone with no air support and no extraction for 19 hours. Reuben beside him, calling wind and distance, his voice steady even as the enemy closed from 3 directions. Elias had joined the Marine Corps at 18, against his father's wishes. His father had wanted him to study astronomy, to spend his life looking up at the stars instead of down the barrel of a rifle. But Elias had needed something else. Purpose, discipline, a brotherhood that civilian life could not provide. He found all of it in Force Recon. Scout Sniper School had been the hardest 8 weeks of his life, and the most clarifying. He discovered he had a gift. Patience, the ability to wait for hours without moving, to slow his heartbeat, to make the shot when the shot mattered. His instructors said he had the coldest trigger finger they had ever seen. They meant it as a compliment. The call sign came after his 3rd deployment. Nightfall, because his targets never saw the sun rise. But call signs are earned in action, not given as honors. Nightfall had been earned in a village outside Kandahar, when Elias held a rooftop alone for 11 hours after his team was extracted without him. Communication failure. Helicopter that could not wait. 11 hours of eliminating enemy combatants one by one until morning brought rescue. When they found him, he had 7 rounds remaining and 16 confirmed kills. His first words to the extraction team were ammunition count and status of mission objectives. His commander said he had ice water in his veins. His commander was wrong. The ice came later, after Ramadi. After Reuben. Elias looked at the headstone and traced the letters of his friend's name with his fingertip. Reuben had been the warmth, the one who remembered birthdays, who wrote letters home for Marines too proud to admit they were homesick, who quoted Pablo Neruda before operations because he said poetry and war were both about finding truth in impossible moments. They had been partners for 7 deployments across 3 continents, 214 missions. Reuben called the wind and the distance. Elias made the shot. They had saved each other's lives so many times that the count stopped matching, until the count reached one that could not be undone. Elias closed his eyes and let the morning sun warm his face. Somewhere below the cemetery, Camp Pendleton spread across the hills where he had trained generations of young Marines. Men who had gone on to serve with distinction. Men who might not remember the instructor who taught them to breathe between heartbeats, to squeeze rather than pull, to become invisible in plain sight. He did not need them to remember. He needed only to remember them, to remember all of them. The photograph in his rucksack showed 11 faces. 7 were now headstones in cemeteries across the country. 2 had taken their own lives in the years after coming home. 1 was in a VA hospital in Texas, his mind trapped in a war that never ended. And 1 was Elias, still breathing, still showing up, still speaking to the dead because the dead were the only ones who understood. He stayed at the grave until the sun was high enough to cast short shadows. Then he rose, his knees protesting again, and touched the headstone one final time. Same time tomorrow, brother. The walk back to the underpass took longer than the walk out. His hip ached from sleeping on concrete, and the heat was building toward another scorching afternoon. He thought about stopping at the soup kitchen on 5th Street for lunch, but decided against it. Too many questions from well-meaning volunteers. Too many forms to fill out. Too many people trying to save him when he was not sure he deserved saving. The thunderstorm came without warning that evening. California's storms were like that sometimes, appearing from nowhere, dumping rain in sheets that turned streets into rivers. Elias gathered his sleeping bag and rucksack and walked until he found a doorway deep enough to provide shelter. He did not know the business was closed for renovation. He did not see the security camera mounted above the door. He only knew that the concrete was dry and the overhang kept the rain from soaking through his jacket. He sat with his back against the door and watched the storm. Lightning flickered across the sky like muzzle flashes, and for a moment he was back on that rooftop in Ramadi, counting the seconds between thunder and strike, calculating distance to the enemy. The police arrived at 2,247 hours. 2 officers, young enough to be his grandsons. They approached with flashlights and hands on their holsters, and Elias raised his palms to show they were empty. The handcuffs were cold against his wrists. The officers did not ask about his service. They did not notice the dog tags beneath his shirt. They saw only what the world had taught them to see. Another homeless man. Another problem. Another entry in the system. They loaded him into the back of the cruiser, and Elias Thorne watched the rain streak across the window, thinking about Reuben, thinking about the 40 Marines whose lives he had saved, thinking about how far a man could fall from the heights he had climbed. Tomorrow he would stand in a courtroom before a judge who would look at him and see nothing worth saving. He did not know yet that tomorrow would change everything. He knew only that he was still here, still breathing, still carrying the weight that had never grown lighter. Still here, brother, he whispered to the empty cruiser, still trying. The courtroom air grew heavier with each passing second. Judge Victoria Ashworth had not moved from her position, leaning forward over the bench, her eyes locked on the man who refused to comply with her order. In 24 years, she had seen defiance in many forms. Angry outbursts, tearful pleas, sullen silence. But she had never seen anything quite like this. Elias Thorne stood motionless, his hands at his sides, his breathing slow and even. He did not argue. He did not explain. He simply waited, as if time itself had no power over him. The gallery watched in uncomfortable silence. Other defendants awaiting their cases shifted on the hard wooden benches, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Lawyers paused their whispered conferences with clients. Even the court reporter, Patricia Huang, had stopped typing, her fingers hovering above the keys as she strained to hear what would come next. Judge Ashworth straightened in her chair and removed her reading glasses, folding them deliberately before setting them aside. It was a gesture she had perfected over decades, a signal that she was about to deliver judgment. Mr. Thorne, she began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. I want to make something very clear to you. I do not know what fantasy you have constructed for yourself. I do not know what stories you tell strangers to earn their sympathy or their spare change. But in this courtroom, we deal in facts, and the facts before me are simple. She gestured toward the file on her desk without looking at it. You were found trespassing on private property. You have no fixed address. You have no employment. You have no documentation of the military service you claim. What you do have is a pair of dog tags that anyone can purchase for a few dollars and a story designed to manipulate the emotions of people too naive to question it. In the front row, Bailiff Nathaniel Reyes felt his jaw tighten. He had heard Judge Ashworth deliver similar speeches before, usually to defendants who deserved every word. But something about this case felt different. Something about this man. Reyes studied the defendant more closely. The torn sleeve of his jacket had shifted, revealing more of the tattoo on his right forearm. Coordinates, definitely. Numbers arranged in a specific pattern that Reyes recognized from his own service. Latitude and longitude. A date. and below them, 2 letters in faded script. RC. The initials meant nothing to Reyes, but the coordinates tugged at something in his memory. Somewhere in Iraq. Somewhere that mattered. Judge Ashworth continued her lecture, her voice rising with theatrical indignation. Do you know how many men I have seen stand where you're standing now? Men who claim to have served in Vietnam, in Korea, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Men who wear patches and pins they purchased online, who memorize enough military jargon to fool civilians, who exploit the genuine sacrifices of real veterans to excuse their own failures. She shook her head slowly, her expression hardening into disgust. It is an insult to every man and woman who actually wore the uniform, and I will not tolerate it in my courtroom. The public defender, Catherine Marsh, finally found her voice. Your Honor, my client has not been charged with stolen valor. The matter before the court is a simple trespassing offense. With respect, the authenticity of his military service is not relevant to these proceedings. Judge Ashworth turned her withering gaze toward the young attorney. Counselor, when a defendant appears before me wearing what he claims are military decorations, it speaks to his character. And character is always relevant when I am determining appropriate sentencing. She returned her attention to Elias, who had not moved throughout the exchange. I will ask you one more time, Mr. Thorne. Remove those dog tags, or I will hold you in contempt and add additional charges to your case. This is not a request. This is an order from the bench. The silence that followed stretched like a wire-pulled taut. Every eye in the courtroom fixed on the defendant. Waiting, watching. Elias Thorne raised his head slowly. His eyes met the judge's, and something in them made her pause. There was no anger in his gaze, no fear, no defiance, only a depth of exhaustion that seemed to reach back decades. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, carrying to every corner of the room. Your Honor, I have been given orders by commanding officers in 3 branches of government. I have followed orders that sent me into places most people cannot find on a map. I have followed orders that cost me things I cannot describe in a civilian courtroom. He paused, and his right hand moved slowly to his chest, resting over the dog tags beneath his shirt. But with respect, I will not follow this order. These tags are not decorations. They are not props. One set belongs to me. The other set belongs to a man who died in my arms 22 years ago, and I have not removed them since the day he stopped breathing. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Ripples of reaction spread through the gallery. A woman in the 3rd row pressed her hand to her mouth. A man near the back, wearing a faded army jacket, slowly rose to his feet. Judge Ashworth's expression flickered, but only for an instant. She recovered quickly, her voice sharpening. A touching story, Mr. Thorne, but stories are easy to tell. Anyone can claim sacrifice. Anyone can claim to have held a dying comrade. Without documentation, without verification, your words are nothing but theater. She turned to the bailiff. Sergeant Reyes, please approach the defendant and remove those tags. He has been given ample opportunity to comply voluntarily. Nathaniel Reyes did not move immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the tattoo visible on the defendant's forearm. The coordinates. He knew those coordinates. He had seen them before, years ago, in a classroom at Camp Pendleton. A case study in long-range overwatch. An operation that was still taught to scout sniper candidates as an example of what one man could accomplish under impossible conditions. Ramadi, March 2003. 19 hours. The instructor who taught that case study had never revealed the sniper's name. Classified, he had said, but the coordinates had been there on the screen, projected for the class to memorize. The exact position where a single Marine had held against an enemy force and saved 40 lives. Reyes looked at the defendant's face. Weathered, aged, but beneath the beard and the dirt and the years of hard living, there was something familiar, a stillness. A patience, the cold focus of a man who had learned to wait longer than his enemies could survive. Sergeant Reyes, the judge repeated, her voice sharp with impatience. I gave you an order. Reyes took a step forward, then stopped. His training told him to follow the judge's command. His instincts told him something else entirely. "Your Honor," he said slowly, his voice catching on the words, "I request permission to examine the defendant's tags before removing them." Judge Ashworth frowned. "For what purpose?" "Verification, Your Honor. The tags contain service information that can be confirmed." The judge considered this for a moment, then waved her hand dismissively. "Very well, but make it quick. This hearing has already wasted enough of the court's time." Reyes approached Elias Thorne slowly, the way one approaches a wounded animal or a man who has seen too much. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them. Recognition that had not yet found words. Reyes stopped an arm's length away. His voice dropped low enough that only Elias could hear. "Force Recon, 2nd Battalion. That tattoo on your arm. Those are Ramadi coordinates, are they not?" Elias said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. Reyes felt his hands begin to tremble. There was only one man who could carry those coordinates on his skin. One man who had earned the right. The question escaped before he could stop it, barely a whisper, barely a breath. "Nightfall?" The word hung in the air between them, fragile as glass, heavy as history. Nightfall, a call sign that had become legend in the Scout sniper community, whispered in training facilities and barracks from Pendleton to Lejeune. A ghost story that young Marines told each other about man who could wait longer than death itself. Elias Thorne did not respond. His eyes held the bailiff's gaze, and in their depths Nathaniel Reyes saw something that confirmed everything he suspected. Not pride, not acknowledgement, only the weariness of a man who had carried a weight too long and too far. "Sergeant Reyes," Judge Ashworth's voice cut through the moment. "What is the delay? I asked you to examine the tags, not engage in conversation with the defendant." Reyes straightened, his mind racing. He needed time. He needed to be certain. But more than anything, he needed the judge to understand what she was about to do. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, "I request a brief recess to verify information relevant to this case." Denied. The judge's response was immediate and sharp. "We will conclude this matter now. Remove the tags or step aside, and I will have another officer do it." Reyes looked at Elias one more time. The older man gave an almost imperceptible nod, as if granting permission for what was about to unfold. Then Reyes stepped back, his hands still trembling at his sides. In the gallery, the man in the faded army jacket remained standing. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and he knew the look of a combat veteran when he saw one. The defendant was not performing. The defendant was enduring. Elias Thorne reached up slowly and lifted the chain over his head. The movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if he were removing something sacred from shrine. He held the 2 sets of dog tags in his palm for a moment, studying them the way a man studies a photograph of someone he has lost. Then he placed them on the defense table. The metallic click echoed through the silent courtroom like a rifle report. Judge Ashworth leaned forward, satisfaction flickering across her features. "There. Was that so difficult, Mr. Thorne? Now perhaps we can proceed with the actual matter before this court." But Elias was not finished. He raised his eyes to meet the judge's, and when he spoke, his voice had changed. The hoarseness was gone. The hesitation was gone. In its place was something cold and precise, the voice of a man delivering an after-action report. 33.4306 degrees north, 43.7261 degrees east. The numbers fell into the silence like stones into deep water. Judge Ashworth frowned. "What are you mumbling about?" Elias continued, as if she had not spoken. "Ramadi, Iraq, March 15th, 2003. Operation Crimson Dawn. Convoy designation Echo 7, consisting of 12 vehicles and 43 Marines, ambushed at 0847 hours in a coordinated attack. 2 vehicles disabled by RPG fire. The convoy pinned in a kill zone with no air support available, an extraction timeline of 19 hours minimum. The public defender, Catherine Marsh, had gone pale. She had handled hundreds of cases in her young career, but she had never heard a defendant speak like this. Every word carried the weight of absolute certainty. I was positioned 400 meters southeast of the convoy on a rooftop designated Overwatch Alpha. My spotter was Corporal Ruben Castillo, 2nd Force Reconnaissance Battalion, 11 years of service, recipient of the Bronze Star with Valor Device. His wife's name was Elena. His daughter's name was Maria. She was 4 years old when he deployed for the last time. In the gallery, the court reporter's fingers had begun moving again, recording every word with hands that shook. Patricia Huang had a brother in the Marines. She understood what she was hearing, even if the judge did not. Elias's voice did not waver. For 19 hours, I maintained overwatch while the convoy held position. Enemy combatants approached from 3 directions. I engaged targets at ranges between 200 and 600 meters. 23 confirmed eliminations. Each shot calculated for wind, elevation, temperature, and the knowledge that 43 Marines were depending on precision. He paused, and something shifted in his expression. The cold precision cracked, revealing something raw beneath. At hour 17, an enemy sniper positioned in a minaret 400 meters northeast engaged our position. I had cleared that minaret twice through my scope. I had marked it as secure. I was wrong. The courtroom had become a vacuum. No one moved. No one breathed. The round was intended for me. Ruben saw the muzzle flash before I did. He pushed me down and took the bullet in his throat, just above his vest. The femoral artery was not hit, but the carotid was severed. I applied pressure with my left hand while I continued engaging targets with my right. Elias looked down at the dog tags on the table, and his voice dropped to barely a whisper. He bled out in 90 seconds. His last words were not your fault. He was looking at the sky when he died. I think he was trying to find something up there, something beyond the war. A sound escaped from someone in the gallery. A choked sob quickly stifled. The man in the army jacket had tears streaming down his face. Elias raised his eyes back to the judge. The convoy was extracted at 0312 hours on March 16th. All 43 Marines survived. I was awarded the Silver Star and the Purple Heart for actions during that operation. Corporal Ruben Castillo was awarded the Navy Cross posthumously. He touched the dog tags on the table with one finger. These are his tags, Your Honor. The blood in the grooves is his blood. I have carried them for 22 years because I made him a promise while he was dying. I told him I would not forget. I told him I would carry him home. The silence that followed was absolute. Judge Victoria Ashworth sat frozen behind her bench, her face drained of color. Her mouth opened, but no words emerged. Bailiff Nathaniel Reyes stepped forward again, his voice breaking as he spoke. I trained at Camp Pendleton in 2001, Scout Sniper School. The instructors used Operation Crimson Dawn as a case study. They never told us the sniper's name because the operation was classified, but they showed us the coordinates. They made us memorize them so we would understand what one man could accomplish. He turned to face the gallery, then back to the judge. Those coordinates are tattooed on this man's arm, Your Honor. I have seen them. They match exactly. This is not a story. This is not a performance. This is Gunnery Sergeant Elias Thorne. Call sign Nightfall. And you just ordered him to remove the tags of the man who saved his life. The words landed like a verdict. In the back of the courtroom, Diane Okonkwo realized her phone had been recording for over 15 minutes. Her hands were steady now, guided by the certainty that she was witnessing something that needed to be seen. Judge Ashworth gripped the edge of her bench, her knuckles white. The theatrical confidence that had defined her career seemed to drain from her body, leaving something smaller and uncertain in its place. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could form words, the courtroom doors swung open with a force that made everyone turn. And in that doorway stood a figure that would change everything. The man who entered the courtroom was not the general. Not yet. He was a court clerk, young and hurried, carrying a stack of files that had nothing to do with the scene unfolding before him. He stopped 3 steps inside the door, sensing immediately that he had walked into something far beyond a routine trespassing hearing. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every face had turned toward the door, expecting something momentous, and finding only a confused administrative employee clutching paperwork. Judge Ashworth seized the interruption like a lifeline. She straightened in her chair and cleared her throat, forcing authority back into her voice. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," she announced, her words clipped and strained. "Bailiff, please ensure the defendant remains in the courtroom." She rose quickly and disappeared through the door behind the bench, her robes billowing as she fled. The door closed with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Spectators leaned toward each other, whispering questions that had no answers. The man in the army jacket approached the barrier separating the gallery from the defense table, his eyes fixed on Elias with something like reverence. The public defender, Catherine Marsh, stood frozen beside her client. She had entered this courtroom expecting to negotiate a fine for a minor trespassing offense. Now she found herself standing next to a man whose service record belonged in a military museum. She touched Elias's arm gently. "Mr. Thorne, I had no idea. Why did you not tell me any of this?" Elias looked at her with eyes that held no accusation. "You did not ask," he said simply. "It does not matter. The charge is trespassing. I was trespassing. The rest is just history." But Nathaniel Reyes was already moving. He pulled out his phone and stepped into the corner of the courtroom, his fingers flying across the screen. Within seconds, he had sent 3 messages to contacts he had maintained since his Marine Corps days. Former instructors, current active duty snipers, anyone who might have access to the classified files that could verify what he already knew in his gut. In the back of the gallery, Diane Okonkwo made a decision. She stopped her recording and opened her social media application. The video was 12 minutes long, capturing the entire confrontation from Judge Ashworth's initial demand to Elias's devastating recitation. Her finger hovered over the upload button. This could end her access to the courthouse. Judges did not appreciate being recorded without consent, but some stories were bigger than access. Some stories needed to be told. She pressed upload and watched the progress bar fill. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away at the federal courthouse, a different kind of morning was unfolding. The Military Law and Justice Conference had drawn senior officers from every branch, gathering to discuss updates to the Uniform Code of Military Justice and Procedures for courts-martial. It was the kind of event that filled hotel ballrooms with stars and ribbons, where handshakes carried the weight of decades and conversations shaped policy. General Marcus Delacroix sat in the 3rd row of the main conference hall, half listening to a presentation on evidence handling procedures. His mind kept drifting to the stack of commendation packages waiting on his desk back at headquarters. 40 years of service had taught him that the real work of leadership happened in the quiet moments between ceremonies. His aide, a young captain named Jennifer Walsh, slipped into the seat beside him and leaned close. "Sir," she whispered, "you need to see this." She handed him her phone. On the screen, a video was playing. A courtroom, a judge demanding that a homeless man remove his dog tags. And then the homeless man began to speak. General Delacroix watched without blinking. He watched as the man recited coordinates that the general recognized instantly. He watched as the man described an operation that had crossed his desk 22 years ago when he was a colonel commanding logistics for a Marine Expeditionary Force. He watched as the man spoke the name Ruben Castillo, a name that appeared on a wall in the general's own office alongside other Marines who had given everything. The video had been uploaded 4 minutes ago. It already had 18,000 views. "Where is this?" the general asked, his voice low and dangerous. "San Diego County Courthouse," Captain Walsh replied. 3 blocks from here. The hearing is apparently in recess right now." General Delacroix rose from his seat without a word. The officers around him looked up in surprise as he moved toward the aisle, his aides scrambling to follow. He did not stop to explain. He did not pause to excuse himself from the conference. Some things could not wait for protocol. Back in the courtroom, the 15 minutes had stretched into 20. Judge Ashworth had not returned. The murmurs in the gallery had grown louder, punctuated by the sounds of phones buzzing as the video spread from account to account, platform to platform. Elias Thorne sat alone at the defense table, his hands folded before him, his eyes fixed on the dog tags that still lay where he had placed them. He did not look at the growing crowd. He did not respond to the whispered questions directed his way. He simply waited, the way he had waited on 1,000 rooftops, in 100 hides, through 19 hours of hell in a city that wanted him dead. Nathaniel Reyes returned to the defense table, his phone still in his hand. His face was pale. "Gunny," he said softly, using the rank that Elias had not heard spoken aloud in years. "I just got confirmation from a buddy at Pendleton. Your service record is real. Everything you said checks out. The operation, the commendations, all of it." Elias nodded slowly, unsurprised. "I know what I did. I do not need a computer to tell me. But there's something else," Reyes continued. "The video of what happened here. It is spreading. Fast. Someone uploaded it during the recess. It has over 50,000 views already." For the first time, something shifted in Elias's expression. A flicker of something that might have been concern or might have been exhaustion. "I did not want attention," he said quietly. "I just wanted to be left alone." Reyes crouched beside him, his voice dropping. "I understand. But Gunny, people need to see this. People need to know how veterans are being treated. What happened in this courtroom today, it is not just about you. It is about every Marine who came home broken and got thrown away by the system." Elias was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out and touched the dog tags on the table, his fingers tracing the letters of Ruben's name. "He would have hated this," he said finally. "Ruben, he never wanted recognition. He just wanted to do the job and go home to his family." His voice cracked on the last word, and he fell silent. The courtroom doors opened again, and this time the figure in the doorway was not a clerk. Judge Victoria Ashworth stepped back into her courtroom, her face composed into a mask of professional neutrality. But her hands trembled slightly as she took her seat behind the bench, and her eyes refused to meet the defendant's gaze. She had spent the recess in her chambers watching the same video that was spreading across the internet, watching herself demand that a Silver Star recipient remove his dog tags, watching her own contempt play out in high definition for the world to judge. Her career, she knew, was already over. The only question now was how much dignity she could salvage from the wreckage. "This court will come to order," she announced, her voice stripped of its earlier theater. "In the matter of the state versus Elias Thorne, I am prepared to render judgment." But before she could continue, the courtroom doors opened one final time, and General Marcus Delacroix stepped through. The uniform entered the room before the man did, 4 stars gleaming on each shoulder, ribbons stacked in rows across the chest, each one representing a chapter of service that most civilians could not begin to comprehend. The dress blues were immaculate, pressed to perfection, carrying the weight of 40 years and the authority of a commander who had sent men into battle and brought them home. General Marcus Delacroix walked with the measured stride of a man who had never needed to hurry. His presence filled the courtroom the way a storm fills the sky, impossible to ignore, demanding attention without asking for it. Behind him, Captain Jennifer Walsh and 2 Marine sergeants in service uniforms took positions near the door. They had not been ordered to follow. They had simply understood that this moment required witnesses. Every person in the gallery rose instinctively. It was not a conscious decision. It was the automatic response of human beings recognizing authority that transcended civilian courtrooms and municipal jurisdictions. Even those who had never served felt the pull to stand. Judge Victoria Ashworth remained seated behind her bench, her gavel frozen in her hand. Her mouth opened, but no words emerged. In 24 years on the bench, she had never seen a 4-star general walk into her courtroom unannounced. General Delacroix stopped in the center aisle, his eyes sweeping the room with the practiced assessment of a man who had commanded thousands. They passed over the stunned gallery, the trembling court reporter, the pale-faced public defender. They lingered for a moment on bailiff Nathaniel Reyes, who had snapped to attention the instant the general appeared. Then they found Elias Thorne. The 2 men looked at each other across 20 feet of courtroom floor and 22 years of history. The general saw a man in rags, beard unkempt, clothes held together with tape and determination. But he also saw the posture, the stillness, the eyes that held steady even now, even after everything. He saw a Marine. Elias saw a face he recognized from briefings and ceremonies, from the photographs that hung in headquarters buildings and the signatures that appeared on commendation letters. He saw the stars that represented a lifetime of service, the ribbons that told stories of battles fought and won. He saw everything he might have become if the war had not followed him home. He did not stand. His legs would not cooperate, locked in place by a combination of exhaustion and disbelief. General Delacroix walked forward until he stood directly before the defense table. He looked down at the dog tags lying on the wooden surface, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, grief, respect. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the room. Gunnery Sergeant Elias Thorne. Call sign Nightfall. 2nd Force Reconnaissance Battalion. Retired. The words were not a question. They were a confirmation, spoken with the certainty of a man who had reviewed the records himself. Elias found his voice, though it emerged rough and uncertain. Yes, sir. The general nodded slowly. I was a colonel in 2003, commanding logistics for IMEF. Operation Crimson Dawn crossed my desk 3 days after it concluded. I read the after-action report. I saw the commendation packages. I know what you did in Ramadi. He paused, and his voice dropped lower. I also know that 43 Marines came home to their families because you did not leave your post for 19 hours. Because you made shots that most snipers could not make in training conditions, let alone under fire. Because you held that rooftop alone after your spotter fell. The courtroom was silent. Even the ambient sounds of the building seemed to have faded, leaving only the general's words hanging in the air. Judge Ashworth finally found her voice. General, this is highly irregular. This court is in the middle of proceedings. Delacroix turned to face her, and his expression hardened into something that made the judge shrink back in her chair. Your Honor, I watched a video on my way here. A video that has now been viewed over 200,000 times. In that video, I saw you order a decorated combat veteran to remove his dog tags. I saw you mock his service. I saw you treat a Silver Star recipient like a common criminal. His voice did not rise, but it carried the force of artillery. I have commanded Marines in 3 wars. I have written letters to families whose sons and daughters did not come home. I have stood at Arlington more times than I can count, and I have never, in 40 years of service, witnessed a more disgraceful display of disrespect toward a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. Judge Ashworth's face had gone from pale to ashen. She gripped her gavel as if it might somehow restore her authority. General, I was not aware of the defendant's service record. He provided no documentation. I had no way of knowing. Delacroix cut her off with a gesture. You had every way of knowing, Your Honor. You could have asked. You could have requested verification before publicly humiliating him. You could have shown basic human decency to a man standing before you in obvious distress. Instead, you chose to make an example of him. You chose to perform for your gallery at the expense of his dignity. He stepped closer to the bench, and his voice dropped to a tone that was almost conversational but carried an edge that could cut steel. Let me be clear about what happens next. The charges against Gunnery Sergeant Thorne will be dismissed immediately, not because of who he is or what he has done, but because prosecuting a homeless veteran for seeking shelter from a storm is a waste of this court's time and the taxpayers' money. Judge Ashworth opened her mouth to protest, but something in the general's eyes stopped her. Furthermore, Delacroix continued, I will be personally contacting the California Judicial Council to recommend a review of your conduct. Not just in this case, but in every case involving homeless veterans that has come before your bench. If the patterns I suspect are confirmed, your career on this bench will end. The judge sat motionless, her face a mask of barely contained shock. In 24 years, no one had ever spoken to her this way in her own courtroom. She had built her reputation on being untouchable, beyond challenge, secure in the absolute authority of her position. That authority had crumbled in less than an hour. General Delacroix turned back to Elias, and his expression softened. He reached down and picked up the dog tags from the table, holding them carefully in his palm. These belong to you, Gunny, And to Corporal Castillo, they should never have left your neck. He stepped around the table and stood before Elias, close enough that his words could be heard only by the two of them. I failed you, he said quietly. The Corps failed you. We trained you to survive anything, but we did not teach you how to come home. And for that, I am sorry. Elias looked up at the general, and for the first time since the proceedings began, his composure cracked. His eyes glistened with moisture he had not allowed himself to shed in years. I do not know how to come home, sir, he whispered. I have been trying for 20 years. I do not know how. General Delacroix placed his hand on Elias's shoulder, the first human contact offered with kindness that the old sniper had felt in longer than he could remember. Then let us figure out together, he said. You're not alone anymore, Marine. Not as long as I have anything to say about it. He lifted the dog tags and placed the chain gently over Elias's head, settling the tags back where they belonged, against the heart of a man who had carried too much for too long. The courtroom remained frozen, witnesses to a moment that none of them would ever forget. And in the gallery, phones continued to record, capturing every second for a world that was only beginning to understand what had happened in San Diego County Courthouse on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The silence that followed the general's gesture stretched across the courtroom like a hell breath. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what they had witnessed pressed down on every person in the gallery, demanding acknowledgement that words could not provide. Judge Victoria Ashworth sat behind her bench, her hands flat on the wooden surface as if she needed its solidity to keep from falling. The gavel lay forgotten beside her. The authority she had wielded like a weapon for 24 years had evaporated in the presence of something greater than judicial power. She cleared her throat, and when she spoke, her voice was barely recognizable. It carried none of the theatrical contempt that had defined her earlier pronouncements. It carried only the hollow sound of a woman who understood that her world had fundamentally changed. The charges against the defendant are dismissed, she said. This court is adjourned. She rose quickly and disappeared through the door behind the bench before anyone could respond. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like finality. The courtroom erupted into motion. Spectators surged forward, phones still raised, voices overlapping in a cacophony of questions and exclamations. The man in the army jacket pushed through the crowd until he reached the barrier, tears still wet on his weathered face. Gunny, he called out, his voice cracking. 3rd Battalion, Fallujah 2004. You probably do not remember me, but I remember you. We all remember you. Other veterans in the gallery began to identify themselves. A Navy corpsman who had served with Force Recon in Afghanistan. A retired sergeant major who had trained at Pendleton in the 1990s. A young active duty Marine who had driven down from Camp Pendleton that morning for an unrelated court appearance and now stood at attention, saluting a man in rags who outranked him in every way that mattered. General Delacroix raised his hand, and the chaos subsided. His command presence had not diminished with the judge's departure. If anything, it had grown stronger, filling the vacuum left by the collapsed proceedings. I need everyone to step back, he announced. Give Gunnery Sergeant Thorne some room. The crowd obeyed, creating a circle of space around the defense table where Elias still sat, his hand pressed against the dog tags that had been restored to his chest. He looked overwhelmed, his eyes darting from face to face as if he could not quite process the attention being directed his way. Bailiff Nathaniel Reyes approached the general and spoke quietly. Sir, there are news crews gathering outside. The video has gone national. They're going to want statements. Delacroix nodded. Captain Walsh, please coordinate with courthouse security. I want a private exit arranged for Gunnery Sergeant Thorne. He has had enough cameras for one day. The captain moved toward the door, already speaking into her phone. The public defender, Catherine Marsh, stepped forward hesitantly. She looked like a woman who had wandered into the wrong story and was still trying to find her footing. General, she said, what happens now? My client has no housing, no resources. The charges are dismissed, but that does not change his circumstances. Delacroix turned to her with an expression that was almost gentle. That is exactly what we are going to address, Counselor. The Marine Corps takes care of its own. even when we have failed to do so for far too long. He turned back to Elias and lowered himself to one knee, bringing his eyes level with the seated man. It was a gesture that sent a ripple of murmurs through the gallery. Four-star generals did not kneel. Four-star generals commanded rooms with a glance and expected others to rise in their presence. But Marcus Delacroix understood something that his stars and ribbons could not convey. He understood that rank meant nothing in the presence of sacrifice, that the man before him had earned more than medals could represent, that sometimes leadership meant lowering yourself to meet someone where they were. "Gunny," he said softly, "I know this is overwhelming. I know you have spent years trying to disappear, trying to carry your burdens alone. But I need you to hear something." Elias met his gaze, and the trembling in his hands slowed. "What you did in Ramadi saved 43 lives," Delacroix continued. 43 Marines who went home to their families. 43 men who became fathers and husbands and teachers and builders because you held that rooftop. Do you understand what that means? Elias shook his head slowly. "I was just doing my job, sir. Reuben was the one who made the sacrifice. I just kept breathing." The general's jaw tightened. "Reuben Castillo died a hero. But you did not stop being a hero because you survived. Living with what you have carried, walking through every day with that weight on your shoulders, that takes a different kind of courage. And the fact that you're still here, still breathing, still visiting his grave every morning, that is not a failure. That is strength." Elias's composure finally broke. The tears he had held back for years began to fall, cutting tracks through the grime on his weathered face. His shoulders shook with sobs that came from somewhere deep, somewhere he had locked away behind walls of silence and survival. The gallery watched in respectful silence. Some wept openly. Others bowed their heads. Nathaniel Reyes turned away, his own eyes glistening, unable to watch the raw grief pouring from a man who had contained it for 2 decades. General Delacroix placed both hands on Elias's shoulders and held him steady. "You are not alone," he repeated. "Not anymore. We're going to get you housing. We're going to get you medical care. We're going to connect you with people who understand what you have been through. And we're going to do it not because the cameras are watching, but because it is what we should have done years ago." Elias tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He managed only a single syllable, rough and broken. "Why?" The general did not hesitate. "Because you're a Marine. Because you served with honor. Because you saved lives that matter. And because Corporal Reuben Castillo would kick my ass from here to Pendleton if I let you spend another night under a bridge." A sound escaped from Elias that was half sob and half laugh. The first genuine emotion beyond grief that he had allowed himself to feel in years. The mention of Reuben's name in that context, the image of his friend's fierce protectiveness, broke through the walls in a way that nothing else could. He would, Elias whispered. He really would. Delacroix smiled, a rare expression that softened the hard lines of command on his face. "I served with a lot of Marines, Gunny. I read a lot of reports. But the bond between a sniper and his spotter, that is something special. Reuben trusted you with his life for 7 deployments. He would want you to trust yourself now." He rose to his feet and extended his hand downward. "Can you stand?" Elias looked at the offered hand for a long moment. In 20 years of living on the margins, he had refused help more times than he could count. He had refused VA appointments, refused shelter placements, refused the outreach workers who approached him with forms and good intentions. But this was different. This was not charity. This was not pity. This was one Marine extending a hand to another. Elias reached up and gripped the general's hand. The strength in that grip, dormant for so long, surprised them both. And slowly, painfully, with the help of a 4-star general and the eyes of a courtroom full of witnesses upon him, Gunnery Sergeant Elias Thorne rose to his feet. The gallery erupted into applause. It was spontaneous and thunderous, drowning out the sounds of the world beyond the courtroom doors. Veterans and civilians alike stood and clapped, some saluting, some simply bearing witness to a moment that transcended the ordinary boundaries of justice. Elias stood unsteadily, gripping the general's arm for support. His legs shook beneath him. His body ached from years of concrete beds and inadequate nutrition. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not feel alone. The private exit that Captain Walsh arranged led through a service corridor behind the courtroom, past storage rooms and maintenance closets that smelled of cleaning supplies and old paper. General Delacroix walked beside Elias, one hand steady on the older man's elbow, guiding him through the fluorescent-lit passage toward a door that opened into an underground parking structure. A black SUV waited there, engine running, a Marine driver standing at attention beside the open rear door. The transition from the chaos of the courtroom to the quiet of the concrete garage was jarring, like stepping from one world into another. Elias hesitated at the vehicle door. His instincts, honed by years of street survival, warned him against enclosed spaces controlled by others. The backseat of a car meant loss of control. It meant trusting someone else with his safety. General Delacroix seemed to understand. He did not push. He simply waited, allowing Elias the time to make his own decision. "Where are we going, sir?" Elias asked, his voice still rough from the emotional storm that had passed through him. "First, we're going to get you something to eat," the general replied. "Then we're going to have a conversation about what comes next. No pressure. No paperwork. Just two Marines talking." Elias considered this for a long moment. Then, slowly, he lowered himself into the back seat of the SUV. The leather was soft, the air conditioning cool against his skin. He could not remember the last time he had sat in a vehicle that was not a police cruiser. General Delacroix climbed in beside him, and Captain Walsh took the front passenger seat. The driver pulled out of the garage and into the bright San Diego morning. Through the tinted windows, Elias watched the city slide past. Streets he had walked countless times looked different from his vantage point. Cleaner, more ordered. The homeless encampments that dotted the underpasses and alleyways were invisible from the main roads, hidden just out of sight of the people who preferred not to see them. The SUV stopped at a small restaurant near the waterfront, the kind of place that served breakfast all day and did not look twice at customers who came in wearing rumpled clothes. The general had chosen it deliberately, Elias realized, somewhere that would not make him feel out of place. They took a booth in the corner, away from the windows and the few other patrons scattered throughout the room. Captain Walsh remained at the entrance, speaking quietly into her phone, handling the logistics that continued to multiply in the wake of the courtroom incident. A waitress appeared, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who took in Elias's appearance without judgment. She poured coffee for both men and left menus on the table. "Order whatever you want," Delacroix said. "As much as you want. This is on me." Elias stared at the menu, the words swimming before his eyes. He had grown accustomed to soup kitchen portions and dumpster finds. The abundance of choices paralyzed him. The general seemed to understand this too. He caught the waitress's eye and ordered for both of them. Eggs, bacon, toast, hash browns, orange juice, more coffee. Simple food. Solid food. The kind of meal that could anchor a man to the present. When the waitress left, Delacroix leaned back in the booth and studied Elias with eyes that had seen too many broken warriors to be surprised by anything. "Tell me about your life since discharge," he said. "Not the official record. The real story." Elias wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, absorbing its warmth. The real story. He had not told the real story to anyone in 20 years. The VA counselors had gotten fragments. The outreach workers had gotten deflections. The other homeless veterans had gotten silence. But something about this moment, this man, this unexpected turn in a day that had started like every other day, made him want to speak. "I came home in 2008, he began slowly. Medical discharge. The shoulder never healed right from the shrapnel, and the headaches got worse every year. They gave me a disability rating and a handshake and sent me on my way." He paused, taking a sip of coffee that burned his throat in a way that felt grounding. "I tried to make it work. Got an apartment in Oceanside. Took a job at a hardware store. Thought I could just blend in, become a civilian, leave the war behind. And it did not work," Delacroix said. It was not a question. Elias shook his head. "The nightmares came every night. I would wake up reaching for a rifle that was not there, scanning the room for threats. The sounds of traffic sounded like incoming fire. The smell of barbecue made me vomit because it reminded me of burning vehicles. He set the coffee cup down and stared at his hands. I started drinking to sleep, then drinking to function, then just drinking. Lost the job, lost the apartment, ended up in my car for a while, then under a bridge when the car got repossessed. The general listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged. He had heard variations of this story 100 times. The details differed, but the trajectory was always the same. Training that prepared men for war, but not for peace. Systems that process veterans like paperwork rather than people. A society that thanked them for their service and then looked away when they stumbled. What about family? Delacroix asked. The records show you were married. Elias's jaw tightened. Margaret. She tried. God knows she tried. But I pushed her away. Told her she deserved better than a man who woke up screaming every night. Told her I was protecting her by leaving. His voice dropped to a whisper. I was not protecting her. I was running. I was too broken to let anyone close. So I convinced myself that isolation was noble. That I was sparing her the burden of watching me fall apart. And the divorce? She remarried a few years later. Moved to Oregon. I heard she's happy now. That is something at least. The food arrived, plates loaded with more nutrition than Elias typically consumed in a week. He stared at it for a moment, then picked up a fork and began to eat. The first bite awakened a hunger he had learned to suppress, and soon he was eating steadily, mechanically, refueling a body that had been running on empty for far too long. General Delacroix ate more slowly, giving Elias space to focus on the meal. When the plates were mostly cleared, the general spoke again. The video from the courtroom has been viewed over 5 million times now. It is on every major news network. By tonight, your story will be known across the country. Elias set down his fork. I do not want this. I just wanted to be left alone. I know, Delacroix said, but sometimes the world needs to see what it has been ignoring. Sometimes one story can change how people think about an entire problem. Your story, what happened to you, it is not unique. There are thousands of veterans living on the streets right now, carrying the same wounds, facing the same indifference. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a note of urgency. You have a choice to make, Gunny. You can take the help we are offering and disappear back into anonymity. No one will blame you. You have earned the right to peace and quiet. Or you can let your story become something bigger. You can become a voice for the men and women who do not have cameras pointed at them. Elias was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. Reuben would have known what to do, he said finally. He always knew the right thing. I just followed his lead. General Delacroix shook his head. Reuben is gone, Gunny. But the man he believed in, the man he trusted with his life for 7 deployments, that man is still here. And that man does not need anyone to tell him the right thing. He knows it in his bones. Elias looked up, meeting the general's eyes. What if I fail? What if I am too broken to help anyone? Delacroix smiled, a sad and knowing expression. Then you fail while trying. And that is still better than succeeding at disappearing. Reuben did not die, so you could spend the rest of your life hiding under a bridge. He died believing you would find a way to keep living. The words hit Elias like rounds from a rifle he had not seen coming. He sat motionless, absorbing their impact, feeling something shift deep in his chest. Outside the restaurant window, the sun continued to climb over San Diego. Somewhere in the city, news crews were setting up for live broadcasts. Somewhere, phones were buzzing with notifications about a viral video that had captured the nation's attention. Somewhere, other homeless veterans were waking up under bridges, unseen and unheard. And in a small restaurant by the waterfront, a broken Marine was beginning to consider the possibility that he might not be as broken as he believed. The afternoon sun had shifted by the time they left the restaurant, casting long shadows across the waterfront. General Delacroix guided Elias toward the SUV, but before they reached it, a woman stepped forward from where she had been waiting near a bench. She was in her 50s, with short gray hair and the kind of calm presence that suggested she had seen difficult things and learned to carry them with grace. She wore civilian clothes, but something in her bearing spoke of military experience. Her eyes found Elias, and held steady, assessing without judging. Gunny Thorne, General Delacroix said, "I want you to meet Commander Sarah Blackwood, retired Navy. She runs a program called Second Watch." Elias studied the woman warily. He had met outreach workers before. They came with clipboards and forms, with promises that led to waiting lists and bureaucratic dead ends. They meant well, but meaning well did not keep the rain off or the cold out. Commander Blackwood seemed to read his thoughts. She did not extend her hand or move closer. She simply stood at a respectful distance and spoke. "I'm not here to fix you," she said. "I'm not here to save you. I am here because I run a place where combat veterans can exist without having to explain themselves. No paperwork, no intake assessments, no 12-step programs unless you want them." Elias frowned. "What is the catch?" "There is no catch. You show up or you do not. The door stays open either way. We have beds, showers, hot meals, and people who understand what it means to carry things that do not fit into civilian conversations." She paused, letting the words settle. "I was a Navy corpsman for 22 years. Spent most of that time with Marine units. Force recon, infantry, everyone in between. I have held young men while they died. I have watched strong men break under weights no one should have to carry. And I have seen what happens when the system that trained them forgets they exist." Her voice carried no self-pity, no agenda. Only the quiet authority of someone speaking from experience. Second Watch started because I got tired of attending funerals. I got tired of reading about veterans freezing to death under overpasses or eating bullets because they could not find another way out. So I took my retirement savings, bought a building, and opened the doors. General Delacroix spoke up. "I have visited her facility, Gunny. It is not a shelter. It is not a treatment center. It is somewhere in between. A place where veterans can decompress without being processed." Commander Blackwood nodded. "We have about 30 residents at any given time. Some stay for weeks, some for months. Some leave and come back. There is no timeline, no graduation ceremony. You stay until you are ready to take the next step, whatever that looks like for you." Elias felt the familiar resistance rising in his chest. The instinct to refuse, to protect his solitude, to maintain the distance that had kept him alive for so long. But something else was rising too, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. The weight of years spent running from help, from connection, from the possibility that things could be different. "I do not know if I can do this," he said quietly. "I have been alone for a long time. I do not know how to be around people anymore." Commander Blackwood smiled, and there was something in it that reminded Elias of the way Reuben used to smile before a difficult mission. Confidence without arrogance. Understanding without pity. "You do not have to know how," she said. "You just have to be willing to try. One day at a time. 1 hour at a time if that is what it takes." She reached in her pocket and pulled out a simple business card. "No logo, no logo. Just an address and a phone number. The building is about 20 minutes from here. There is a bed available if you want it. Not a cot in a crowded room. An actual bed in a space you can call your own." She held out the card, and Elias looked at it for a long moment. Such a small thing. A piece of paper with an address. But it represented something enormous. A choice. A direction. A step away from the life he had built around his own disappearance. He reached out and took the card. His fingers trembled slightly as he held it. General Delacroix placed a hand on his shoulder. "I have to return to the conference, Gunny. There are people waiting for me, and the situation from this morning has created complications that need to be addressed. But I'm not abandoning you. I will check in tomorrow, and I will make sure you have everything you need." Elias nodded, not trusting his voice. The general turned to Commander Blackwood. "Take care of him, Sarah. He has earned that much and more." "I will," she replied. "You have my word." Delacroix looked at Elias one final time, and something passed between them, an understanding that transcended words. Then the general climbed into the SUV, and within moments he was gone. Elias stood on the sidewalk, holding the card, watching the vehicle disappear into traffic. The afternoon sun warmed his face, and the salt breeze from the harbor carried scents that reminded him of deployments and homecomings and all the years in between. Commander Blackwood waited beside him, patient and unhurried. "What happens now?" Elias asked. "Now I drive you to second watch," she said. "You take a shower, eat some dinner, and sleep in an actual bed. Tomorrow you wake up and decide what the next day looks like. That is all. Nothing more complicated than that." She gestured toward a modest sedan parked nearby. "I know it is not a general's SUV, but it runs well and the air conditioning works." Elias almost smiled. It had been so long since he had allowed himself that expression that the muscles felt unfamiliar. They drove through San Diego in comfortable silence. Commander Blackwood did not fill the space with questions or reassurances. She simply drove, allowing Elias to watch the city pass by and process everything that had happened. The building that housed Second Watch was a converted warehouse in an industrial area east of downtown. From the outside, it looked unremarkable. Brick walls, small windows, a parking lot with a handful of vehicles. Nothing to suggest what waited inside. But when Commander Blackwood opened the front door, Elias stepped into a space that felt immediately different from the shelters and intake centers he had avoided for years. The main room was large and open, with comfortable furniture arranged in clusters rather than rows. A kitchen occupied one corner, and the smell of cooking food filled the air. Bulletin boards on the walls displayed job listings, meeting schedules, and photographs of smiling faces. But there were no institutional posters about drug policies or curfew rules. No security guards or sign-in desks. Most striking were the people. A dozen men and women occupied the space, some reading, some talking quietly, some watching a television mounted on the far wall. They looked up when Elias entered, and he braced himself for the scrutiny he had learned to expect. But what he saw in their eyes was not judgment. It was recognition. They saw his worn clothes, an unkempt appearance, and understood without needing explanation. Several of them nodded in acknowledgement, then returned to their activities, giving him space. Commander Blackwood led him past the common area toward a hallway lined with doors. "Each resident has their own room," she explained. "It is not large, but it is private. You can lock the door if you need to. Some of our guys need that at first." She stopped before a door marked with a number 7 and handed him a key. "This one is yours for as long as you need it. Dinner is in about an hour. You are welcome to join us or eat in your room. Whatever feels right." Elias took the key and turned it over in his palm. Such a small thing. A piece of metal that represented something he had not had in years. A place to belong. He opened the door and stepped inside. The room was simple. A bed with clean sheets, a small desk, a lamp, a window that looked out onto a courtyard where someone had planted flowers. Nothing fancy, nothing institutional. Just a room, just a bed, just a beginning. Elias sat on the edge of the mattress and felt the softness yield beneath him. He could not remember the last time he had sat on something that was not concrete or packed earth. He looked at the dog tags resting against his chest, then lifted them and held them in his palm. 2 sets of tags, 2 lives intertwined. "We made it somewhere, Reuben," he whispered. "I do not know if it will last, but we made it somewhere." The tears came again, but this time they felt different. Not the sharp grief of the courtroom. Something softer, something that might, in time, become healing. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Elias watched it descend, marking the end of a day that had started under a bridge and ended in a room of his own. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, new possibilities. But for now, for this moment, he was somewhere safe. And that was enough. The first week at Second Watch passed in a blur of small adjustments. Elias learned the rhythms of the building, the unspoken protocols that governed life among men and women who understood trauma without needing it explained. He learned that breakfast was served at 7, but no one judged you if you slept through it. He learned that the showers had unlimited hot water, a luxury that brought him to tears the first time he stood beneath the stream. He learned that Commander Blackwood meant what she said about no pressure, no timeline, no expectations beyond basic human decency. He also learned that he was not the only ghost in the building. The other residents moved through their days with the careful deliberation of people rebuilding themselves one piece at a time. There was Marcus, a former Army Ranger who had lost both legs to an IED in Kandahar and spent 3 years on the streets of Los Angeles before finding his way to second watch. There was Elena, a Marine combat engineer who had survived 4 deployments only to lose her battle with addiction in the years that followed. There was Thomas, a Navy corpsman who still woke screaming from nightmares about the men he could not save. They did not ask Elias about his story. They did not need to. The video from the courtroom had spread far beyond San Diego, and by the time he arrived at second watch, everyone in the building knew who he was. But they treated him no differently than they treated each other. In this place, medals and commendations meant less than showing up for meals and participating in the quiet work of recovery. The outside world, however, had not forgotten. General Delacroix visited on the 3rd day, arriving in civilian clothes rather than his dress uniform. He sat with Elias in the courtyard, drinking coffee and watching the flowers sway in the afternoon breeze. The video has been viewed over 50 million times, the general said. News networks have run segments every day. Veterans organizations are mobilizing across the country. There are protests outside the San Diego courthouse demanding accountability. Elias stared in his coffee cup. What about the judge? Delacroix's expression hardened. Victoria Ashworth resigned 2 days ago. The California Judicial Council launched an investigation before she could be formally removed. They are reviewing every case she handled involving homeless defendants. So far, they have identified over 300 cases where she may have violated ethical standards. 300, Elias repeated quietly. 300 people who stood where I stood. Yes, and most of them did not have a 4-star general walk through the door to stop it. The general leaned forward, his voice dropping. That is why your story matters, Gunny. Not because of what happened to you, but because of what it revealed. The system failed you, but it has been failing veterans for decades. Now people are paying attention. Now there is pressure for change. Elias was silent for a long moment. Then he asked the question that had been weighing on him since the courtroom. What do you want from me, sir? Delacroix shook his head. I do not want anything from you, Gunny. You have given enough. But I will tell you what I hope. I hope that when you are ready, you will consider speaking publicly about your experience. Not for cameras or headlines, but for the veterans who are still out there, still invisible, still falling through the cracks. He stood and placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. But that is your choice to make. In your own time. For now, focus on yourself. Heal. Rest. Remember what it feels like to be a human being instead of a survivor. The general left, and Elias sat alone in the courtyard until the sun began to set. The second week brought a visitor he did not expect. Commander Blackwood found him in the common room on a Tuesday afternoon and told him someone was waiting in her office. She did not say who, only that the visitor had been vetted and approved. Elias walked down the hallway with the wariness of a man who had learned to distrust surprises. He pushed open the office door and stopped. A woman sat in the chair across from Commander Blackwood's desk. She was in her 40s, with dark hair streaked with gray and eyes that held a familiar intensity. She wore a Marine Corps t-shirt beneath a simple jacket, and when she saw Elias, she rose to her feet with the controlled grace of someone who had spent years in uniform. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, she said. My name is Maria Castillo. I am Ruben's daughter. The world tilted beneath Elias's feet. He gripped the doorframe to steady himself, his vision blurring as the past and present collided with devastating force. Maria, the little girl in the photographs Ruben had carried through 7 deployments. The 4-year-old who had waved goodbye at the airport the last time her father left home. She stood before him now, a grown woman, carrying her father's eyes and her father's quiet strength. I know this is a shock, she continued, her voice gentle but steady. I have been trying to find you for years. After the courtroom video went viral, I finally knew where you were. Elias could not speak. He could barely breathe. The dog tags beneath his shirt seemed to burn against his chest, carrying the weight of a debt he had never been able to repay. Maria stepped closer, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. My father wrote letters home every week he was deployed. My mother saved all of them. After he died, she gave them to me when I was old enough to understand. She reached in her bag and pulled out a worn envelope, yellowed with age. This was his last letter. He wrote it the night before the ambush in Ramadi. He wrote about you. Elias shook his head, backing away. I cannot. I am sorry. I cannot. Please, Maria said. I need you to hear this. I have needed you to hear this for 22 years. She opened the envelope and unfolded the letter with trembling hands. Her voice shook as she read. Maria, my little star, by the time you read this, you will be old enough to understand what your papa did for a living. I want you to know something about the man I serve with. His name is Elias Thorne, and he is the best Marine I have ever known. If anything happens to me over here, I want you to know that it will not be his fault. He blames himself for everything, even things he cannot control. That is what makes him so careful, so precise, so dedicated to bringing everyone home. Maria's voice broke, and tears spilled down her cheeks. But she continued, if I do not make it back, I want you to find him someday. Tell him that I am proud to serve beside him. Tell him that whatever happens, it was my choice to be here. And tell him that the only failure would be if he stopped living because of me. He has so much more to give. Do not let him forget that. She lowered the letter and looked at Elias through her tears. I have carried these words for 22 years, she said. I have looked for you at every veterans event, every memorial service, every homeless camp I could find. And now I am here to deliver my father's message. Elias stood frozen, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking with the force of emotions he had suppressed for 2 decades. Maria crossed the remaining distance between them and took his hands in hers. It was not your fault, she said, her voice fierce with conviction. My father knew the risks. He chose to serve. He chose to protect you because that is who he was. And he would be furious if he knew you spent 20 years punishing yourself for something that was never your fault. Elias broke. The walls he had built crumbled. The silence he had maintained shattered. He collapsed into Maria Castillo's arms and wept, great heaving sobs that poured out of him like blood from a wound finally allowed to heal. She held him, this daughter of his fallen brother, and she did not let go. I forgive you, she whispered, even though there is nothing to forgive. I forgive you. And in that moment, in that small office in a converted warehouse, Elias Thorne began to understand that survival might not be betrayal after all, that living might be its own form of honor, that Reuben's sacrifice had not been in vain. The weeks that followed Maria's visit marked a turning point that Elias could feel in his bones. Something had shifted inside him, a weight redistributed if not entirely lifted. He still woke before dawn, still carried Reuben's tags against his chest, still spoke to his fallen brother in quiet moments. But the conversations had changed. They were no longer apologies whispered into the void. They were updates, reports from a man who was finally trying to live. Commander Blackwood noticed the difference first. She saw it in the way Elias began joining meals in the common room instead of eating alone in his quarters. She saw it in the way he started nodding to other residents, then speaking to them, then sitting with them during the evening hours when the building grew quiet and the veterans gathered to share silence or stories, depending on what each night required. She saw it most clearly when Elias began to help. It started small. A new resident arrived one morning. A young Marine fresh from Afghanistan, hollow-eyed and trembling with the particular terror of a man who had not yet learned that the war followed you home. He stood in the doorway of the common room, frozen, unable to cross the threshold into a space filled with strangers. Elias rose from his chair and walked over to him. He did not speak. He simply stood beside the young man, close enough to offer presence without pressure, and waited. After a long moment, the young Marine whispered, I do not know how to do this. Elias nodded. Neither did I, still figuring it out. But the coffee is good, and no one here is going to ask you questions you do not want to answer. He led the young man to a seat, poured him a cup of coffee, and sat with him in comfortable silence while the morning light filled the room. Commander Blackwood watched from the doorway, and she allowed herself a small smile. By the end of the second month, Elias had become an unofficial anchor at Second Watch. He was not a counselor or a staff member. He held no title and received no compensation. But he was there, steady and present, a living example of what survival could look like when you stop running from help. The other residents began seeking him out. They came to him with nightmares they could not shake, with memories that ambushed them in quiet moments, with the particular loneliness of men and women who had seen things that civilians could never understand. Elias listened. He did not offer solutions or platitudes. He simply listened, and in his listening, they found something they had been missing. Someone who understood without needing explanation. General Delacroix continued his visits, arriving every few weeks to check on Elias's progress and update him on developments in the wider world. The judicial investigation into Victoria Ashworth had expanded, revealing a pattern of misconduct that extended back over a decade. 17 judges across California were now under review for similar behavior. Legislation was being drafted to require trauma-informed training for all judges handling cases involving homeless veterans. The video from the courtroom had sparked something larger than any single story. Veterans advocacy groups had united around a common cause. Donations to homeless veteran programs had tripled. News outlets that had previously ignored the crisis were now running investigative series on the failures of the VA system. And through it all, Elias remained at second watch, quietly rebuilding a life he had thought was beyond repair. Maria Castillo visited regularly, bringing photographs of her father and stories from his letters that she had never shared with anyone. She introduced Elias to her mother, Elena, who had remarried but never forgotten the Marine who had died protecting his brothers. The three of them sat together on the anniversary of Ruben's death, sharing memories and tears and the particular comfort of grief held in community. Elena told Elias about the early years after Ruben's death, the folded flag that sat on her mantle, the medals that Maria had inherited, the hole in their family that never fully healed but eventually became something they could carry rather than be crushed by. "He loved you like a brother," Elena said. "In all his letters, he wrote about you more than anyone else. He trusted you completely." Elias bowed his head. "I failed him." "No," Elena replied firmly. "You honored him. Every shot you took after he fell, every hour you held that rooftop, you honored his sacrifice. And you're honoring him now by finally allowing yourself to heal." The words landed differently than they would have months earlier. Elias could feel himself beginning to believe them. 3 months after arriving at Second Watch, Commander Blackwood asked Elias to speak at a gathering she was organizing. It was a small event, just a few dozen people, mostly donors and community members who supported the program. She wanted him to share his story, not for publicity, but to help others understand what veterans experienced when the system failed them. Elias resisted at first. Public speaking was not something he had ever sought. His entire career had been built on invisibility, on being the unseen presence that eliminated threats from a distance. The idea of standing before a crowd and exposing his wounds felt like a betrayal of everything he had been trained to be. But Commander Blackwood did not push. She simply said, "Think about it. The door stays open." Elias thought about it for 3 days. He thought about Ruben's letter and Maria's tears. He thought about the young Marine who had frozen in the doorway and the countless others who were still out there, invisible and suffering. He thought about General Delacroix's words in the restaurant, about becoming a voice for those who had no cameras pointed at them. On the 4th day, he found Commander Blackwood in her office and told her he would do it. The night of the gathering arrived with the kind of clear, cool weather that reminded Elias of nights on deployment when the stars seemed close enough to touch. He stood backstage in clothes that Maria had helped him pick out, clean and pressed, and fitting properly for the first time in years. His beard was trimmed, his hair cut short, his posture straight. He did not look like a homeless man anymore. He looked like what he had always been beneath the grime and the grief. A Marine. Commander Blackwood introduced him with simple words. She spoke of his service, his sacrifice, his years on the streets, and his journey to Second Watch. She did not sensationalize or dramatize. She simply told the truth. Then she stepped aside, and Elias walked to the podium. The faces before him blurred together at first. Donors in expensive clothes, community volunteers, a few journalists in the back with notebooks and cameras. He gripped the podium, and felt his hands trembling. Then he saw Maria in the front row, sitting beside her mother. She smiled at him, and something steadied inside his chest. He began to speak. "My name is Elias Thorne. My call sign was Nightfall. I serve in the United States Marine Corps for 28 years, most of that time in force reconnaissance. I have been awarded the Silver Star, the Purple Heart, and commendations that I cannot discuss because the operations remain classified." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "But none of that matters as much as what happened after I came home. After I came home, I fell apart. I lost my marriage. I lost my apartment. I lost my ability to function in a world that had no place for the skills I'd spent my life developing. I spent 5 years living under a bridge 3 miles from the base where I trained young Marines to do what I did." He paused, letting the silence hold the weight of his words. "I am not here to ask for sympathy. I am here to tell you that my story is not unique. There are thousands of veterans on the streets of this country right now. Men and women who served with honor, who sacrificed everything, who came home to find that the nation they defended had no room for them anymore." He looked directly at the cameras in the back of the room. "We train these men and women to survive anything. We send them into hell and expect them to function. But we do not teach them how to come home. We do not prepare them for the silence after the gunfire stops. And when they stumble, we look away because their pain makes us uncomfortable." His voice dropped, but it carried to every corner of the room. "I am asking you to stop looking away. I am asking you to see the veteran on the corner, the one holding the cardboard sign, the one you cross the street to avoid. I am asking you to remember that beneath the dirt and the despair, there might be a warrior who gave everything and received nothing in return." He straightened, and his final words rang out with the clarity of a man who had finally found his mission. "Ruben Castillo died in my arms 22 years ago. His last words were not your fault. I have spent 2 decades trying to believe him, and now, finally, I am ready to honor his memory not by punishing myself, but by fighting for the brothers and sisters who are still out there, still suffering, still waiting for someone to see them." He stepped back from the podium, and the room erupted in applause that shook the walls. 6 months had passed since the morning Elias Thorne stood in a San Diego courtroom and watched a judge demand he remove his dog tags. 6 months since a 4-star general walked through those doors and changed everything. 6 months since a broken man began the slow, painful work of becoming whole. The Veterans Advocacy Conference filled the ballroom of a downtown hotel, drawing hundreds of attendees from across the country. Military officials in dress uniforms sat beside congressional staffers in suits. Nonprofit directors exchanged cards with journalists. Donors who had written checks after seeing the viral video now gathered to see the man behind the story speak again. Elias stood backstage, adjusting the collar of his shirt. The clothes still felt foreign after so many years in rags, but he was learning to carry them with the same discipline he had once applied to his rifle. Maria stood beside him, her presence a steady anchor against the nerves that still surfaced before public appearances. "You ready?" she asked. Elias touched the dog tags beneath his shirt. Both sets still hung there, his own and Ruben's, resting against his heart where they had rested for 22 years. "Your father should be the one up there," he said quietly. He was always better with words. Maria shook her head. "My father's up there. Every time you speak, you carry him with you. You would be proud, Elias. So proud." The conference organizer appeared in the doorway and nodded. They were ready for him. Elias walked onto the stage to applause that rolled through the ballroom like thunder. He had grown accustomed to this response over the past months, though it still unsettled him. He had spent his career avoiding attention, perfecting invisibility. Now he stood in spotlights, his face known to millions, his story repeated in documentaries and news segments and congressional testimony. He reached the podium and waited for the applause to fade. The faces before him represented power and influence, people who could shape policy and direct resources. But Elias did not see them as an audience to impress. He saw them as tools to be employed in a mission larger than himself. 6 months ago, he began, "I was arrested for sleeping in a doorway during a rainstorm. I stood before a judge who saw my appearance and decided I was worthless. She ordered me to remove my dog tags, calling them costume jewelry. She mocked my service without bothering to verify a single claim I made. He paused, letting the memories settle over the room. That judge resigned in disgrace. The video of our confrontation has been viewed over 100 million times. I have testified before Congress, met with the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, and spoken at events like this one across the country. His voice hardened. But none of that matters if we do not translate attention into action. The cameras have moved on to other stories. The hashtags have faded from trending lists. And tonight, right now, as we sit in this comfortable ballroom, there are veterans sleeping under bridges and in alleys and in the shadows of the bases where they once served with honor. He gripped the podium and leaned forward. I know because I was one of them. I know the cold that seeps into your bones on winter nights. I know the hunger that becomes so constant you stop noticing it. I know the shame of being invisible to a society that thanks veterans for their service and then steps over them on the sidewalk. The room was silent, every eye fixed on the man at the podium. Since that day in the courtroom, I have dedicated myself to a single mission. Not revenge against the judge who humiliated me, not celebrity or recognition for myself. My mission is to ensure that no veteran ever has to stand where I stood, facing a system that sees their suffering as an inconvenience rather than a crisis. He straightened and gestured toward the audience. In this room tonight, we have the power to change things. We have legislators who can draft bills. We have donors who can fund programs. We have journalists who can shine lights into dark corners. And we have veterans who can speak the truth that no one else can speak. His voice rose, filling the ballroom with a conviction forged in decades of service and years of suffering. The question is whether we will use that power, whether we will let this moment fade into memory, or whether we will build something lasting from the attention we have been given. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter but no less intense. I cannot do this alone. Commander Sarah Blackwood cannot do it alone. General Delacroix cannot do it alone. It requires all of us working together, refusing to look away, refusing to accept that veterans dying on our streets is simply the cost of maintaining a military. He looked directly into the cameras broadcasting the speech to screens across the country. To the veterans watching tonight who are still in the darkness, I want you to hear me. I was where you are. I believed I was beyond help, beyond hope, beyond the reach of anyone who might care. I was wrong. Help exists. People exist who understand what you carry and want to walk beside you as you learn to carry it differently. His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. You are not alone. You are never alone. And if you take one step toward the light, I promise you there are hands waiting to help you the rest of the way. He stepped back from the podium, and the applause that erupted was not the polite appreciation of a satisfied audience. It was something raw, something that carried emotion and commitment and the energy of people ready to act. Elias descended from the stage and found General Delacroix waiting for him. The general had retired 2 months earlier, stepping away from active duty to dedicate himself fully to veterans advocacy. He had established a foundation in Ruben Castillo's name, funding transitional housing and mental health services for combat veterans. Hell of a speech, Gunny, the general said, extending his hand. Elias shook it firmly. Just telling the truth, sir. Same as always. Commander Blackwood appeared beside them, her face glowing with pride. Second Watch received 47 donation pledges during your speech. We will be able to open a second facility by the end of the year. Elias nodded, but his attention had shifted to a figure approaching through the crowd. Nathaniel Reyes, the bailiff who had first recognized him in the courtroom, pushed through the well-wishers with purpose in his stride. Gunny, he said, slightly out of breath, there is someone here who needs to see you. A veteran. He saw the speech on the monitors in the lobby. He has been living on the streets for 3 years. He says he is ready to ask for help, but he will only talk to you. Elias did not hesitate. He excused himself from the general and Commander Blackwood and followed Reyes through the crowd, past the donors and dignitaries, toward the lobby where a man in tattered clothes stood trembling near the entrance. The man was young, maybe 30, with the hollow eyes and guarded posture that Elias recognized instantly. A Marine Corps tattoo was visible on his forearm beneath layers of grime. He looked up as Elias approached, and something like hope flickered in his expression. "You are him," the young man whispered. "Nightfall. I saw the video. I saw what you said." Elias stopped before him, close enough to offer presence without pressure. "What is your name, Marine?" "Corporal Devin Harris. 3rd Battalion, Helmand Province, 2014. I have been trying to disappear for 3 years. But tonight, when I heard you speak, I thought maybe I do not have to disappear anymore." Elias placed his hand on the young man's shoulder, the same gesture General Delacroix had offered him in that courtroom 6 months ago. "You do not have to disappear," he said firmly. "You do not have to carry this alone. There are people here who understand, who want to help, who will walk beside you for as long as it takes." He turned and gestured toward Commander Blackwood, who had followed at a respectful distance. "This is Commander Sarah Blackwood. She runs a place called Second Watch. No paperwork, no bureaucracy, just a bed, a meal, and people who have been where you are." Devin looked at the commander, then back at Elias. His voice shook as he spoke. "I do not know how to do this." Elias smiled, the expression coming easier now than it had 6 months ago. "Neither did I. But you take the first step, and the rest follows. One day at a time. 1 hour at a time if that is what it takes." He put his arm around Devin's shoulders and began walking him toward the people who would help him find his way home. Behind them, the ballroom continued to buzz with conversation and commitment. Donations were pledged. Partnerships were formed. Plans were made that would touch thousands of lives in the months and years to come. But for Elias Thorne, the mission had always been simpler than policy or funding. It was the Marine before him, trembling and terrified, but finally ready to accept help. It was the next veteran after that, and the one after that, an endless chain of broken warriors who needed someone to show them that healing was possible. He thought of Ruben, of the letter Maria had read to him, of the words his fallen brother had written 22 years ago. He has so much more to give. Do not let him forget that. Elias had not forgotten, and as he walked Corporal Devin Harris toward the first day of his new life, he knew that Ruben was walking beside them both. Still watching, still believing, still proud. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in the most unexpected forms, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share these stories that honor the warriors our society too often forgets. And we want to hear from you. Who is the quiet hero in your life? Who is the person whose sacrifice goes unnoticed, whose service deserves recognition? Share their story in the comments below, because sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on distant battlefields, but in the hearts of those trying to find their way home. Thank you for watching. And remember, every person you pass on the street carries a story. Some of those stories might just be legendary,